when I would hear that, my address was posted on social media or my phone number, it was like, it's out there anyway, of course. Right. And when it's being spread around for a purpose that's less than, that is being spread around to harass, it definitely puts you on edge.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today, a conversation with newly re-elected Midtown Assemblymember Meg Zaletel. After surviving a recall election last fall, while she was sponsoring COVID mitigation mandates for the municipality, which led to some of the most angry, vicious assembly meetings in Anchorage history, she was named as the interim director of the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. We talk about all of that and her hopes for the next 3 years. Note, this interview was recorded in Meg Zaletel's home, which has an open floor plan with lots of windows. So you're going to hear traffic outside, her dogs barking throughout, her family members moving around, and her husband setting off the fire alarms while cooking dinner. Well, Meg Zaletel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You grew up in Iowa, correct?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about growing up there?
I want to say it feels like a quintessential Midwest experience, but I guess unless you're from the Midwest, you don't know what that is. I grew up in a small town, but only about 20 minutes from the city, Des Moines, which is the capital of Iowa. So it was a little bit of rural and urban mixed together. I don't know, it was pretty uneventful, but in all the ways that you see maybe childhood portrayed in the movies. Very idyllic in a lot of ways. Went to college there and law school there. I didn't leave Iowa to go to school and didn't actually really leave until came and moved to Alaska in 2005. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood? We all played sports, we were in band or chorus, we spent our lives at school. Consolidated schools in the northern part of the county, and we'd go to school at 7 a.m. for the first activity and stay until close to 8 at night until the last activity was done. So it was just lots of school. Oh, and football is really big in Iowa with marching bands and football games and that kind of thing.
And what were your extracurricular activities?
I played sports, and then I was in the band. So I played softball, basketball, did a little bit of volleyball, played a year of football because that was my fourth sport. My sister also played football.
So it was co-ed football? Or?
No,
okay.
This was boys football. I was the first on the high school football team in my school. And then my sister played in junior high.
Did your parents support that? I mean, were they like, our girls are going to play football?
They didn't care. They just let us do what we wanted to do. It was that or volleyball, and my sister and I weren't interested in volleyball. I believe now they have soccer. There wasn't such a choice as soccer when we were in high school.
So you stayed in Iowa. You did college in Iowa. You did law school in Iowa. Yep. Why'd you leave Iowa?
I got a job in Alaska, which is why I left. I wanted to practice rural poverty law, and I worked for the corollary of where in Iowa I worked for the corollary of where I ended up working for in Alaska, and I had a job. And I ended up interviewing in Atlanta, Georgia when they were out for a conference because that was a cheap way to get me there and we could meet in person. And I took the job, graduated law school, and flew up here.
So rural poverty law.
Yep.
What is that? I mean...
So people, I wanted to do law that just dealt with people's issues that didn't have good access to legal representation. We know what legal services does. So lots of evictions, debt work. And then in rural areas, it's even harder sometimes because there may not be a legal services office for many, many miles. I had done an internship in Tullahoma, Tennessee, which is right at the Alabama-Tennessee border with legal services. And then I had done an year-long internship in law school at Iowa Protection and Advocacy, which was disability rights. And so wanted some combination of those things when I took a job. And so I landed at the Disability Law Center of Alaska, which let me represent people regardless of their means, but generally they couldn't hire lawyers all over the state for legal cases related to a disability that they had.
So you got that job based in Anchorage, but working for the whole state.
Yeah.
Can you give an example, and it doesn't have to be a real example, but a hypothetical example, how somebody would end up with you as their lawyer?
Sure. So we would get phone calls all the time with various legal problems. Often, so I started my practice representing kids who needed special education services from the school district. So parent would call up. We'd learn about the case. I had those cases take me all over rural Alaska because if you can't resolve with the district informally, then parents have the right to sue.
Your husband's a lawyer as well?
Nope, chemical engineer.
Oh, wow. See, I didn't know. Chemical engineer. And did y'all move to Alaska together, or?
Yes.
Okay, so you met in Iowa.
Yes, we met at a Howard Dean house party.
Wow.
In 2003.
Wow. Almost a 20-year anniversary coming up.
Yeah. And we actually have a picture from the day we met, which meant someone actually had to have a camera and developed the film back then. So we've both been at a Howard Dean house party because Iowa's First Nation caucus. So the candidates were rolling through for the 2004 election. So this would have been George W. Bush's re-election. And so we had gone to this house party for Howard Dean, and then we had mutual friends who lived in the apartment above, and we met up there, and then the rest is history.
The rest is history. Was he open to moving in Alaska? And did y'all come for your job?
So I got actually one other job offer before the one in Anchorage, and it was in Kotzebue. And he looked it up and he said no. And looking back, that was probably good because I've been to Kotzebue several times. I like being there, but I can't imagine ever having lived there. So, he came and went to school and got a master's degree at UAA. So I just finished school. He had been working, and then we kind of did the inverse while I was working, and he got a master's degree. And then, classic story, going to stay for a couple of years, and now it's been about 17.
Wow. Why did you run for assembly?
Because if it had been a job that had simply been advertised in terms of like the help wanted ads, it's something I saw I could do. And I have skill sets, I think, in the background and a perspective that I think is valuable. It's just the oddest way ever to go and interview for a job, 4,000 doors later, and seeing what the vote is. I mean, it's an interesting way to get a job, but that's how I kind of approached it. I was like, oh, this is a job, and this is a job I think I could do.
How has it been like a job? How has it not been like a job?
It's absolutely been like a job in that it's work. It's a lot of work. And it pretty much met my expectations for the type of work. Absorbing large amounts of information, analyzing things, working to solve problems. I mean, I had skill sets for those things. And before I ran, and early while I was running, I actually went and talked to sitting assembly members and said, tell me a little bit about this. Like, what is it really like? Not the politics side, but like the day-to-day. And like, do you enjoy working with your colleagues? Because I'm a mid-career professional at that point. I want to make sure I'm going to work with people, that regardless of the political part of it, but like that would want to work together and work together for the to solve problems. I think the part I didn't expect, of course, was a pandemic and what that brought, and then just the political nature of it. I mean, it sounds odd. I ran for political office. Yeah, I didn't expect the politics, but I think the politics have been ramped up higher than they had possibly been in the past.
Your first time was 2017?
I was elected in 2019.
2019. I guess in the same way that you would ask about any other job, how's your job satisfaction?
Well, I ran for re-election.
And won. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. It's pretty high. The occasional dust-ups, that you see on the dais or the disagreements, it's not comfortable, it's not pleasant, but for the most part, it's just about getting the work done and getting something to fruition, whether that's making sure recently, like, someone's needing their alley paved, like, knowing that that's in the pipeline, great, or someone's fence got hit by a snowplow and that they're going to go out and take care of that. Just being the conduit to make things move forward, that's terribly satisfying.
I want to ask about the boring work of being an assembly member, because a lot of it is really boring.
I guess I don't find that part boring. That's the part I like. I like to get down in the weeds, in the details, in the documents. Like, that's where I thrive.
I'm super grateful that we have people like you who do that, who do their homework, read the material, read the documents, have questions about things that other people would just not even dive into. Like, they wouldn't see it. I want to talk about your assembly time in two sort of sections. What did you enjoy most about being an assembly member prior to March 2020?
So I came on the body and got a little bit thrown in the deep end by being named chair of the Committee on Homelessness at the time by my Midtown colleague, Felix, who was chair of the assembly at the time. I really enjoyed figuring out what that meant, because we had, I don't know if you remember, but Ethan Berkowitz at the time declared a state of emergency on homelessness because the governor had cut a bunch of money. And so really just navigating that kind of situation was interesting. There was more politics to the problem solving than I realized.
Is that when you started becoming sort of an expert on homelessness? I mean,
yes. So I did not know a ton about homelessness prior to serving in that role. It had intersected with my work sometimes. I had clients when I worked at the Disability Law Center who had experienced homelessness or were experiencing homelessness. And that was more about how to navigate the system with them to still take care of their legal issue, not try to solve necessarily their living situation. Mm-hmm. And I have to really credit Nancy Burke. I walked hip and hip with her kind of throughout that summer, really close partnership, got to know Jasmine Boyle. And then basically the three of us just worked extremely close together. And then, once we kind of got to COVID, then that kind of changed the landscape. And we just continued to work very closely together because there was big issues that needed to be resolved. And putting our heads together, we really want to say, okay, what have we done and what can we think about doing differently? And how can we marry the policy side with the implementation side, make sure there's money, and really just kind of keep after the issue. The municipality had a plan, but didn't feel like it was being strategically implemented. It was either always short on money or political will or something. And so we really started to collaborate quite a bit then.
This is your old friend, the Spirit of Alaska. We Alaskans are a fiercely independent bunch. That's right, Polaris. We don't care about what those big wigs down south think. We take care of our own up here. That's why our local politics is so much more important than whatever Washington has cooked up. Polaris here also loves the clean air and majestic mountains, and of course, listening to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I was just getting to that. No need to be rude to the nice people. Polaris also wants you to know the best way to support the podcast is to tell a neighbor to listen in, because we all gotta look out for each other.
And then COVID happened, and things changed. Mm-hmm. How did you know it had changed? Or was there a moment when you knew things felt different as an assembly member?
Yeah, the day we had an emergency meeting with the emergency declaration, I was on spring break in Fairbanks. The last trip, before COVID was Fairbanks for spring break. And having to be on an assembly meeting, in the middle of the day to talk about what were we doing? The mayor has declared an emergency and we need to extend it. I mean, I talk about a crash course for members who hadn't been around during the earthquake. Right. Those who'd been around, in the earthquake, at least it was maybe a bit familiar, but the rest of us wasn't. It wasn't. And then just watching, assembly leadership and the mayor's rules roll out. And I mean, it was very different very quickly. And then trying to talk to your constituents about why there's this thing called, hunker down and, things are shut, and really just searching for information and figuring out ways to take all this information and very quickly communicate it to a group. And so Felix and I spent a lot of time very early on in the pandemic, creating some graphics and getting things out because that part wasn't kind of up and running yet on the municipal side.
While Felix was chair, there was a lot of hostility in the assembly meetings. What was that experience like behind the dais?
But you could definitely tell that it changed. I would say it didn't change because Felix was chair. Felix just happened to be chair during a really stressful time. And Felix was chair for 2 years.
Right.
So you got 1 year pandemic and 1 year pre-pandemic in a way. And he always kept us just so organized and on track. He's so impressively cool to, a lot of public concern coming on the dais. When we are doing the work on the dais, I often forget that everyone else is out there. I'm in the work, doing the work. Obviously, during public testimony, I'm hearing the public and stuff, but then, and it's been taken in. But then I've got my notes and I've got the item before us and I'm concentrating on my colleagues for the debate. Very rarely does what's happening out, in the public audience area catch my eye because we're doing the business of the city. But you can tell the overall how intense the chamber feels for sure.
When that recall against Felix happened, I'm sure that you guys supported him and knew that it was like a difficult time. In retrospect, asking did you think it would happen to you? Did you think that what was happening was going to happen?
So when Felix's recall petition was filed, I had one filed at the same time. Yes. And his went forward, whereas mine didn't because he was chair and I was not.
Gotcha.
And mine was appealed. So we were on a similar trajectory, but mine took a
lot longer. Got it.
His was, appealed by him, but it was different trajectories and different things. So yeah, I was totally aware that it could happen, but I felt rotten for him. Felix is just the guy who's cool under pressure all the time. I am endlessly impressed because when my recall finally went through, that it was going to hit the ballot, I was gutted. Basically, it's a statement saying, well, to me, I took it as, well, you're not doing a good job.
Right.
You don't know how to do your job. You're unfit for your job. And, well, I knew it was baseless. It's still really an unfortunate question to put before the voters. It's pretty ridiculous.
It's also unfair. I'll just speak as a District 4 constituent that both my assembly members had recall elections done, against them, and it didn't happen to other people. And I know, I'll just speak for myself, but I feel like it's because there are people with money who can sort of do these sorts of things. There's people with means. It costs money. I feel like if somebody with those kinds of means lived in a different district, it would have happened against different people.
I'm not sure I agree with that because I think it's a testament to the diversity of opinion in Midtown. Midtown is a district that is very independent. It's got its own mind. And that's actually one of the great things about representing Midtown. It's a dynamic district. I guess I can't get this far into, what the other districts are like, but I'm not sure it would have happened in all of the other districts. Felix and I recalls were almost kind of identical in terms of the signature collection and those things. So it shows that there is a group of constituents who, enough that wish somebody else was representing them. And that's okay. That's why we have elections. It's unfortunate when it turns into using a mechanism like a recall to try to basically hold an early election.
Right.
That's the unfortunate part because it's a huge distraction and waste of money. I don't really get the sense that recalling a progressive member in West Anchorage would happen.
Having gone through this experience yourself, what are your feelings about the state of the electorate and people who are hell-bent on getting their people in at all costs, and if they're not in, something isn't quite right. It can't possibly be right.
My first election, we didn't have election observers for the campaign. wasn't anything we worried about. I trust vote by mail.
Mm-hmm.
Trust Barbara Jones. I actually knew her professionally back in the day when she was at the AERC, and I was a baby lawyer and some things. And I was like, oh, like no doubts in the electoral system. At the recall, we didn't do election observers either. Wasn't concerned about it. And then I believe we may have had an election observer volunteer for a part of the time this past election. But again, I'm not concerned, and the only reason then wasn't so much because we were concerned about the election, but about the other observers. And so I think the scrutiny on the election system is fine. It's good, but it needs to not get in the way of conducting and having safe and secure elections. I mean, there's a balance to be struck there. And I've been really disheartened to see the kind of targeting of the clerk in the clerk's office about elections when I know she's carrying out the code. I've heard her say, oh, well, we had this mistake and here's how we corrected it. To me, that's integrity, is to say, oh, there was a mistake, here's how we corrected it. Please let us know if that's problematic. You know, that continual quality improvement. And I think that there isn't enough of air in the room right now to look at nuance and look at things like being able to admit you make a mistake and correct it, or that you're going to continually improve the election system without assuming it's all for nefarious reasons. So for my purposes, I've basically said that's noise. I'm going to set that to the side and make sure that our election staff and our elections go forward using, you know, the best information we have at the time, that we make changes to the code. And for our own campaign, so on the political side, that's not a concern to us. To anyone who's complained or had concerns about vote by mail, I just remind them, go vote in person. It's always an option. It seems like just running down a rabbit trail just for purposes of sowing discontent. And there's so many other things that we could be concentrating on. If there were real doubts, there were real concerns, I would take them very seriously. But for the most part, there haven't been. I mean, this election, the one concern I had was when the ballots were late, but then it was explained. And we made, you know, we took the time to make sure people got their ballots, or at a point they didn't. We talked to them about how they could still go vote. You just have to be adaptable. It doesn't mean there's some grand scheme to try to invalidate an election or someone's trying to cheat.
Right. Well, you know, you went through the recall. Terrible. But at the same time, there was the mask mandate testimony. There was so much vitriol launched specifically toward you. I guess, did you ever think about not running again?
That's a good question. So when you are running in a recall election so close to re-election, I think the expectation is that you will run for re-election. Our family took like a beat for about a week. I'd already filed my letter of intent that I was going to run for re-election. So we took the beat, we talked about it, and at that point we said, well, we're going to run because I still had some work I wanted to do. And I think it wasn't about the results of the recall one way or the other. It was just about like, okay, now let's refocus. Like, what do you want to do if you are reelected? Is there, you know, what is the value proposition here? And do we think we can win? I mean, the recall in a lot of ways was more of a distraction and an anomaly from kind of staying focused on what we really wanted to do, which was the work. And I say we because serving and running are family affairs. So it is a continual family conversation because it's time I'm not spending with my family. It's not time I'm not getting, you know, to do things with them.
Well, I want to ask about that. How did your family react to the testimony that was being given? I mean, I don't know if you got nasty voicemails or emails or anything like that, but I would guess that there was probably some. Was your family worried about you?
Yeah, we really didn't talk about it much. I tried to, with a child, so I
Right.
just try to keep that like kind of quiet. My husband and I would talk to make sure like, okay, things are good, or like we check in. A couple of times I texted him in chambers saying, okay, this is like, so most of the hot time of the mask debate, I was at home.
Right.
Because people weren't wearing masks.
Right, and it was crowded.
And that was the whole point.
Right.
But afterwards, and actually on the night we passed the mask mandate, I let my husband know. I texted him. I said, okay, this is what's about to happen, and just kept him informed and made sure like he had another member's spouse's number and that kind of thing, just to make sure we felt like we were covered. And that wasn't something I ever contemplated needing to really think about. When I would hear that, my address was posted on social media or my phone number, it was like, it's out there anyway, of course. Right. And when it's being spread around for a purpose that's less than, that is being spread around to harass, it definitely puts you on edge.
How do you feel moving forward for the next 3 years?
So I'm pretty optimistic because I feel like it probably is only going to go, kind of go up from here. I still have some priorities that I think are moving in the right direction, so I can see the trajectory forward. This is my second term, but it will be my last term on the assembly. I'm only going to do 2 terms, so a total of 6 years, partly because of the way it intersects with my child's school years. And so I think it's...
Do you have specific plans about what you're going to do in 3 years from now?
No, I just... my child will just be finishing middle school at that point, and I just think that that's kind of a nice time to be able to reset, see where she's at. High school's a big deal. It's the last 4 years and then off to college or wherever. Right. So really want to, make space for that up front. And see, where our family is. I think that's important. And I think 3 years is right about that amount of time to kind of go in to do what I planned to do while I ran, which was to bring my particular skill set and knowledge to make Anchorage a better place. So hopefully by then, mobile crisis team will be up running 24/7. Crisis stabilization will have come online in our community as well. Hopefully we'll have made considerable progress on homelessness. Like these social issues, I think I've already started to lay some of the foundational pieces with policy, and then my colleagues with the alcohol tax to fund it, really refining and honing that approach over the next 3 years. And then I think I've probably served to my highest and best use with my particular skill set. Doesn't mean I don't have other interests or could become more expert in other areas of municipal government, but I always came in to be value added on top of what the skill set was that was available. And unless there are other mental health lawyers with my kind of background running for office, that's what I'll continue to focus on and do.
The one thing that's unusual about you, or I don't think it used to be unusual, it's unusual now, is to have another full-time job while you're an assembly member. It seems like the movement has been recently that the assembly itself is a full-time job, and people who had worked full-time jobs are having to step back to part-time or work somewhere else or change things around. But you became the interim director of the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. It sounds like that grew out of that first committee assignment from Felix when you first started. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to take on that job? And
Sure. So it's only 3/4 time,
okay.
So it's not full time. And members, when I came on the body, most members held other jobs unless they were retired. And at the time, I had my own legal practice, so I've always kind of juggled both. But yeah, the decision to take that was really a question of, I was doing considerable amounts of work in my role in the assembly around homelessness, working really closely, as I said, with Nancy and Jasmine, and really trying to make sure we were headed in the right direction. And so when that opportunity came about, we talked, my husband and I did. It's like, ultimately, it's a community issue. And there was a community need, a big community need. And so we decided that that was a reasonable thing to do because I was already spending so much time. So in some ways, it just let me get in a lane and go to achieve a lot of the things that we're already working on to keep that work going.
What's kind of a bummer for those of us kind of on the outside looking in is that we had this assembly member who was, if not a subject matter expert, very close to it for an assembly member, who now has taken a job which requires her to recuse herself from certain things having to do with homelessness. And so I guess, how could you allay constituents' fears that, you know, that you're not able to contribute in the way you had before?
Sure, and that's a really great question. So one, I know that Felix, it has a lot of expertise in this area as well, and I can still talk to a couple of members, and Felix and I worked very closely together. So I wasn't worried about Midtown being adequately represented. I was more concerned about the community losing its momentum on trying to solve homelessness. And to me, that was the higher and better use, which actually gets to what constituents want, which is to solve homelessness, you know, or to solve the symptoms that they see or the complaints that they have.
What I've heard you say, what I've heard lots of people say is that the answer to homelessness is housing, that housing is what we're talking about. Is there talk of like a homeless, not a homeless, a housing project? Like, can we do a low-income housing project in Anchorage? I mean...
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. The answer is yes, and it's probably going to look like a hotel conversion.
Okay. This interview.
The kind of housing you're talking about, and I mentioned it at the work session when I was asked about it, is the housing we really need is, we often refer to it as workforce, but extremely low-income housing. 30% average median income and lower. That's really low.
Can you give a number? What is 30% average median income?
No, I can't. I'd have to go and look because it's done by location and some other factors, but it's low.
Like $30,000 a year?
Yeah, or lower. And so what hotel conversions often let you do is create the salient features of a home, which are a door and a lock, a lease, which are rights, which is a big one. There's often communal kitchens, so you can still prepare food if there isn't a kitchenette in the unit. And they're really a stepping stone. But that type of housing lets someone get a good rental history, maybe save some money. You know, rental on those units are anywhere between $675 and $900 a month, depending on some of the features and various things. You can't do that on the open market, and you can't build new and make it pencil to charge that kind of rent. You have to, you have to balance those things. And the other bit is you have to be able to also tap into maybe a HUD funding source to cover the gap, because the rents alone probably won't equal the operation costs of the building, because usually those buildings are staffed. Because we're going to continue to help people. Just because you're housed doesn't mean the case management stops or you know, the housing navigation stops. So, but it's possible, and it's working in other communities. We I've been working on a bunch of pro formas for housing or for hotel conversions, various configurations of hotels that we know could be available. And I think that they're very promising. It's ways to get hundreds of units very quickly online.
Because they're hotels that the hotel owner is looking to sell because they're just not getting tourists. They're not making money.
It doesn't even matter about the why they're selling, but they're selling. Okay. And as long as they're selling and they have a certificate of occupancy and they're habitable, like, great, you know, and we can. So in Vermont, they have some of the oldest hotel conversions. Their hotel conversions kind of go through three phases. First, it's like, let's just get it in and use it. And then as the utilization rate starts to come down a little bit because people are finding other stable housing, they start to upgrade them. Maybe they add those kitchenettes or whatever. And then they work more toward kind of what we think of as traditional apartment unit housing. So they kind of phase them through. So there's like different lives of that building. Or maybe it's okay, our utilization rate is down. We have this other opportunity where we could have more traditional units in an apartment, but we're not going to make the original conversion into non-congregate shelter, which is great. It's not congregate, it's non-congregate shelter, which is a lot more like rapid rehousing.
Right.
At least we're keeping people from the trauma of congregate shelter.
Right.
Giving them that security, that lock, that door.
They're not in a room with 100 other people.
Yeah. So there's a lot of potential there, especially as we just keep talking about the lack of housing units
Right.
in Anchorage. We've got to move the needle.
So what you need is like a desperate hotel owner to hear this and say, maybe this is something I need to look into.
Well, there's and I mentioned at the work session, there's one potentially underway here very shortly and be up to 130 units.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's a good catalyst because when we see that kind of investment happening in the city, and that we've got plans for that kind of number, that number of units of people experiencing homelessness going into housing, other landlords see that and they say, oh, well, I've got units. Can you backstop me as well?
Right.
And we do. And that's what we're doing. There's a landlord housing partnership. And so we see it just kind of continue to snowball in a good way. More and more units come online. And that's eventually how we solve homelessness. We get to functional zero for a subset of the population.
So one last question, and I am springing it on you, but it is a request. People liked when I used to ask all of our guests to recommend a book at the end of the podcast. So I'll ask you to recommend a book. If you could think of one, and it could be anything. It doesn't have to be your favorite book of all time.
I will recommend my favorite book of all time, which is Don Quixote.
Oh, wow.
I love that book.
Yeah.
Yes. I can picture, it sounds so bad, but I can picture Monty Python movies in my head while I read it. Actually, I probably will be taking that on my vacation to Spain.
How many times have you read it?
4.
But about to do number 5?
Yeah, maybe. I might take it because you can kind of read, and I like that it's a book that I can read in different ways to kind of get different parts of the story emphasized. Sometimes I read just to kind of refresh my memory about the story. Sometimes I read just for the dialogue or different things.
And you said you're going to read it in Spain. Will you be reading it in Spanish?
No, I do not speak Spanish.
Okay. Just curious.
No, that English will work for me.
Well, Meg Zaletel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable, and thanks to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe, rate us, and review us. Next week, former mayor and West Anchorage Assembly member Austin Quinn Davidson with her wife, former First Lady Stephanie. Please tune in.